In part 2, we're going to be covering the entire core of the box and lid in thick card. And here I'm drawing the piece for the bottom, and this is where we will start. Now, card has two sides. Every bit of card has two sides. One is a finished side, and the other is a rough side. And I have this rough side up, and I'm drawing the line. And this is where I'm going to cut from, this side, so that the piece, once it's cut out, the finished side, which is against the table, is the correct the correct shape and size for the bottom of the box. This card is about 0.8 millimeters or 1/32 of an inch thick, and it's gray. And I always put the finished side on the outside of a piece that I am putting card on. The rough side takes the glue better, and so there's a better adherence if the rough side is glued to the cardboard. And the finished side presents a better surface for working with, for either painting directly onto the surface, or in the case of this box, covering it with paper. The exception to this is if I am using what I call cereal box card. For a number of years, the only supply of card that I really had were recycled cereal boxes. And this is an interesting card. It's very thin. It has a very glossy surface on one side and a fairly finished surface on the interior. Now, it's very economical because I was just saving my own cereal boxes and having friends save cereal boxes for me. So there's an abundant supply of it. It's really inferior in general in terms of quality, in terms of how sturdy a wall it ultimately creates. But it is usable. And in this box, I will be using cereal box card to line the interior of the box. When I'm using the cereal box card, I actually put that high gloss finish side in and have the unfinished or less finished side out. The high gloss side does not take paint very well. So I just slather a lot of glue on there when I'm attaching it, and it makes a good enough attachment. But ordinarily with card, I want to put that unfinished side against the piece and have the finished side out. Now, in this box, I'm starting with the bottom, putting the card on, and I'm cutting the piece out to fit that bottom. The rest of the card that I'm going to put on, I'm going to approach differently. I'm going to put a larger piece just on there and then cut off the excess once I've got it on. But in order to do that, I really need to have an edge to cut against. And at this point, I don't really have any firm edges to cut against. So I want to cut a piece that fits perfectly on that bottom as the very first piece. And everything else that I attach will be referenced to that piece, essentially. And we will use that bottom piece to establish the straight lines of the bottom and the corners, those four sharp corners. This bottom piece will basically determine those. If I had started with a side piece, it would have been less accurate. So here we're gluing card to the cardboard. Takes a lot of glue. You want to get a really good coat, thick coat of glue on the cardboard. If it's not glued thoroughly and well and evenly across the surface, when it comes to painting, the moisture will cause the card to bubble up off of the cardboard. It sort of unglues itself, and you end up with this bubble under the surface, this bulge under the surface that sometimes goes away and sometimes doesn't. So always use a lot of glue when adhering the card to the surface. Now I'm just spreading it on really thick here. And also concentrating on the edges, the corners. This is where it really usually wants to come off an edge. It'll stick fine in the center, but it'll want to come off the edge. So wipe off the excess, and then we let it dry for a while. Now, putting on this much glue on cardboard, it takes longer for the surface of the glue to get that right consistency that we want before attaching the piece. So where it's usually taking, you know, 1 puff and a sip of coffee, this will take 2 puffs and 2 sips of coffee. And I judge it by the shininess of the surface. When it gets to the right dryness, we've lost a lot of that really high gloss of the wet glue, and it starts to dull just ever so slightly. And if you put your finger on it, it's real tacky, real sticky when it's just right. And so here we go. We're ready for putting the piece on the glue. Now it's going on rough side down and finished side out. And then there's a lot of pressing, a lot of making sure that it's flush on all the sides and the end. And I do this just by pressing against the tabletop surface. And it just takes a lot of careful adjusting to make sure that it's in the right spot. You want to do this when it's wet and you can move it around. If it's dry and it's in the wrong spot, then you've got to trim it and it becomes a real mess. And so the more accurate you are at each step, the better off, the easier the piece is to make, basically. So we got that on there, and we're going to put some weight on it and set it aside. Now, while the bottom is drying on the box, I'm going to start putting the card on the lid, these 3 layers of the lid. Now this is approximately 3/8 of an inch thick. But I want to cut a piece of card, a strip of card, that is as accurate as possible here. I don't want to get it too wide or necessarily too narrow. So I'm very carefully measuring, looking for what is the best width to cut to make sure that I get good coverage without exceeding the width of the cardboard too much. Now, in approaching a piece like this, a big flat piece with 4 raw edges, I want to do those raw edges first. This will give me lines to cut against, solid edges to work with. So once I have finally determined the width of the piece, I want to figure out how much I need in terms of length to cover all 4 of these sides. And it turns out to be about 18 to 20 inches to comfortably cover all those sides. So, in cutting strips, this is a little different than cutting rectangular pieces. I start with a straight line. I must have a straight edge to start measuring things against. Then I always mark more than I will need. Here I will actually only need 2 strips at this length to cover all the way around the edges of the lid. So I'm marking for 3 or 4 strips, because cutting strips is sometimes not that easy. Sometimes the blade travels as you're trying to cut it straight across the along the strip, and the strip is unusable. So I always mark for more than I am actually going to need, so that as I'm cutting, if I mess one of them up, I've got it already marked and it's easy just to cut another one. So we mark the ends with our little pokey tool, and here a pencil just doesn't work. You really need a pokey tool, because the pencil just won't penetrate the card enough to leave enough of an impression to use for a guide for cutting. In cutting strips, I'm always cutting on the finished surface. They're always measured and cut finished surface up, because this is what we're going to be working with. This is what we really need to be accurate, is this finished surface. It's best to have a very sharp blade when cutting strips. If you're doing this with a dull blade, it makes for a very sort of jagged cut, and the blade tends to travel, swerve away from the cutting edge if the blade is too dull. Now, in cutting cardboard, I talked about how every cut with an X-Acto knife is at an angle, at a slant. It always slants in to the left as a right-handed person. As a left-handed person, it would slant into the right. So when I'm cutting strips, I'm generally stacking them. I'm not having a gap in between so I can cut in on both sides. So a strip has one edge that is angled in towards the center of the form, and one edge that is angled out from the form. So a strip ultimately is always a little bit bigger than the measurement itself. But that edge that extrudes out from that measurement line is very soft and is easily bent over. And instead of wasting the card and doubling the cutting time, I always cut my strips in this way, instead of having a gap between them so I can cut each side separately. And I make use of this one side being protruding and one side cutting in as I put the piece together, as I apply these strips. Okay, now here I'm marking that leading edge on each strip, the side, the edge that actually is cut in towards the center of the form, not the edge that extrudes out from the measurement line. Because this is the edge that I really want to work with. It's the most reliable edge, so it is going to be the one that creates, that goes flat against the tabletop. You'll see in just a moment. As with the cutting of the cardboard, I've only cut partway through these lines. So now I'm going to cut the rest of the way through. This, as I said, saves the blade. It saves sharpening the blade so often. Now here I'm smoothing that leading edge, because when I cut that edge in card, it sort of raises the lip of the very surface of that edge up, that very thin leading surface of the edge. So I want to flatten that out now. It's easier to flatten it out now than later. And I do that with my thumbnail. I just go over it with my thumbnail, see that it's nice and flat instead of raised up. And each cut produces an edge like that on the leading edge of the cut. The side that protrudes from the measuring line does not create that sort of beveled edge. So here I am smoothing that edge again. Okay. It's really wise to do this every time you cut a strip. Now, once my pieces are cut, I further cut each strip down into the size that I will need to work with. And I make sure that that leading edge is marked on each one, so I don't want to lose track of that leading edge. Since this is a raw edge, we want to put a lot of glue there into the corrugation, let it soak in. I've already determined which face of the lid is going to be the top and which is going to be the bottom, the inside face. And so I'm setting the top side against the table, and I'm putting that leading edge down on the top side so that it is our most accurate line at this point. And I'm pressing it in and down as I have it against the flat surface of the table, so that it is a good straight line. And you can just immediately go ahead and put on the next opposing side piece. And we want to do these long sides first because these are our sturdy edges. The side edges of the lid there, are the short edges, are cut with the grain as opposed to across the grain, so they're not as sturdy. So by putting them on the long edges first, the ones that are cut across the grain, we can then establish good corners for building the rest of the card. Again, that leading edge of the strip goes down against the table, and it's the top side of the lid that is against the table. And we just want to make these as perfect as we possibly can at this point, and get rid of all the little excess glue. Okay, while the lid is drying a bit, we'll put the card on the ends of the box. Now this is done a little differently than the bottom was. Here I'm not cutting out the perfect size piece. What I'm doing is I'm cutting a piece that's a little too big, but I'm also giving myself one straight edge, one straight leading edge actually on the cut. And this edge will go, the box will be put lip down on the tabletop, and that leading edge will go against the tabletop. So that leading edge is going to be forming the lip of this box. And we want to do all these side pieces basically rooted on that lip of the box, because we want to create a nice even lip around the top of the box. So we use a lot of glue as before, and wipe off the excess, and then set the box lip down on the table and that leading edge against the table. And then we make sure that it is all quite well adhered. And then we do the same for the other side, the other end. Okay, while the box dries a bit under pressure, we trim the edges of the first pieces we put along the sides of the lid. And be careful in trimming these. Make sure they're good and square and right up to the edge, as accurate as possible. And then we apply the next edges to the narrower ends of the lid. Okay, now I'm coming to trim the excess off the card that I've applied to the ends of the box. Now to do this, you need a very sharp blade. A brand new blade is of course absolutely best, but a sharpened blade at any rate. And these cuts have to be made very carefully. I'm basically pushing almost bending the blade at the very tip by the pressure that I'm exerting against the wall that I'm cutting against, the line that I'm trying to draw there with the blade. And in this case, I'm cutting all the way through each time before moving on to the next cut. And especially these sides here, where I'm cutting against the raw cardboard, you have to be very careful with these cuts, very accurate. Otherwise you can get some really nasty gaps in your corners. Doesn't matter very much since we're papering the form, but if you're not going to paper the form, these cuts have to be especially accurate. Okay, now I'm going to apply card to the sides of the box. And this is the same process as putting it on the ends of the box. I need to create a straight line to work with, a leading edge that will go down on the lip. And while that's drying under pressure, I will trim the excess from the side strips on the lid. And again, these need to be good, accurate cuts. And then I'm using my thumbnail or my fingernail to smooth those edges and make them all nice and perfect. And now I will put card on one side of the lid. And while that dries under pressure, I go back to the box and attach card to the final side, again with that leading edge on the lip. Now that it's dry enough, it's time to start trimming the excess off the edges of the card on the sides of the box. And for this, I'm just using the scissors. These are really great scissors for trimming card. They have a really broad, flat blade that can snuggle up right next to the edge I'm cutting against and give me a good cut, a good straight cut. It's easier and quicker than cutting with an X-Acto knife, but in many ways not quite as exact. So for the end pieces, it really needs the X-Acto knife more than the scissors. But for these, it's good. The scissors are fine. As you see here, I'm using my thumbnail a lot to smooth edges, and this is one of my handiest tools, my hands and my fingernails, and so it's really the only way to smooth the rough cuts of the edges. For trimming the lid, the excess card from the lid, I'm using the X-Acto knife because I want it to be as exact as possible. The scissors are just too inexact for the lid. This is going to be what the ICs first, really. So it needs to be as perfect as possible. Now that the one side is covered and all trimmed and perfect, we'll add the card to the final side of the lid. Okay, now I come to lining the interior of the box with card. And as I said before, I'm going to be using cereal box, a thin cereal box card for the interior. Now, lining an interior is different than doing the exterior. With the interior, I'm going to cut pieces for each of the sides that I am going to be covering with card. So the bottom, the floor, the bottom, and the four sides. And I'm going to cut pieces that are, they need to be either exactly the size that I measure needing, or slightly bigger. And I will trim them down to fit. So it's all approximate. I just want to get some straight edges to work with here. And it's fairly straightforward. There really won't be any need for commentary throughout this process. When lining an interior with card, the first piece that needs to be glued in, fit and glued in, is the floor, the base. And as expected, the piece is just a little bit too big, so I will trim it down until it fits perfectly. And now I will trim the final excess card from the lid. And it's a perfect fit. So all that remains to be done now, in terms of covering the entire thing with card, is the lip of the box itself. And this is much like doing the edge around the lid. I'm going to be cutting strips and applying them. Again, the same principles of leading edge and keeping the leading edge all in one direction applies. Here I'm actually evening that raw edge of the lip out, making sure that when I apply card there, it's all going to lay nice and flat and smooth. And that's all there is to it. In the next video, part 3, we'll be covering the entire box and lid with paper, which gives it a really nice finish.